The Ukraine invasion isn't going well for Russia. That much is evident from the fact that it's still ongoing, even though Vladimir Putin thought it would all be done and dusted in a matter of days. Ukraine's brave resistance has weakened Russia, but at least Putin can console himself with the knowledge that he is fighting an enemy outside of Russia's borders. Not anymore. Ukrainians aren't the only fighters that Russia's leader has to worry about. There are partisans inside Russia itself, and they are very active. Putin has been betrayed from within, as a group of Russians has just crippled the Kremlin's war machine. Those Russians call themselves the Freedom of Russia Legion, and they have been active from the moment that Putin launched his Ukraine invasion. We'll dig deeper into what the group is and what it does later. For now, it's enough to know that the Freedom of Russia Legion opposes Putin's regime so fiercely that it's willing to fight for Ukraine to get him out of power. That's precisely what the group did in early November, as the Kyiv Post reports. On November 6th, the outlet shared a story describing how the Freedom of Russia Legion has just carried out a wave of attacks across Russia, all of which targeted Russia's locomotives. Russia's train lines are the arteries that crisscross the country and make it possible for Putin to wage his war. The country's locomotives are the lifeblood, and dozens of them are now burning thanks to a series of sabotage operations targeting trains that carry weapons and ammunition from Russia and into Ukraine. The Freedom of Russia Legion has confirmed the attacks, so too has Ukraine's main intelligence directorate, or HUR. The latter raising its voice implies that HUR has been working alongside the partisan movement operating inside Russia, perhaps by providing it with guidance on which targets it can strike to do the most damage to the Russian war machine. That's speculation, of course, but what isn't speculative is that the Legion has pulled off a spectacular sabotage operation right under Putin's nose. HUR provides some of the details in a Telegram post that confirms the success of the attacks. The Freedom of Russia resistance movement against the Kremlin regime has conducted a series of successful operations targeting the enemy's logistical infrastructure, HUR reported before confirming how the movement managed to pull off its attacks. There were no missiles or other complex weapons of war involved. All that Freedom of Russia needed were some flammable liquids and matches. The partisans' Molotov cocktails incinerated the control and power supply systems of dozens of vehicles that provided transportation of military cargo, HUR adds. This statement tells us two things. First, the Freedom of Russia Legion got up close and personal with the trains it was sabotaging. That either means that members of the group are working on Russia's rails, or the trains that the Kremlin relies on to keep the gears of its war machine turning are being left so exposed that unauthorized people can sneak onto them. Second, HUR is clearly in contact with the Russian resistance movement. The last few months in particular have seen Ukraine conduct multiple strikes inside Russia that are designed to cripple Putin's supply lines. Most of those strikes have focused on Russia's refineries and energy sector, with the most recent happening on the same day as HUR confirmed the train attacks. But with these sabotage operations, we're now seeing Ukraine expand its scope, with the help of partisans, to hit the vehicles that deliver the oil and crucial equipment throughout Russia and to the front lines. This wasn't a random attack, it was carefully coordinated, and Ukraine knew it was happening long before Putin and his cronies realized that dozens of their trains were burning. The story wouldn't be complete without a statement from the movement itself. The Freedom of Russia Legion is proud of the attack that it just pulled off. It's also taken to Telegram to confirm its sabotage operation and to deliver a message to Putin that whatever he may think about Russian support for his illegal operation is wrong. Many Russians oppose him, and they're willing to put themselves at risk to support Ukraine. While those for whom everything has already been decided sit back on their comfortable sofas doing nothing, we are taking action and reaching a new level, the Legion said in a statement that appears to be aimed at other Russians who don't support Putin but are perhaps too scared to resist him directly. We have destroyed dozens of locomotives transporting weapons, ammunition, and equipment to the front. The Legion capped off its Telegram post with a warning to Putin. The Legion's resistance continues to grow stronger and expand across the country. Putin's scum will live in fear and forget what security means. Nowhere in Russia is safe from this partisan movement. And Putin can't do a thing about it because the Kremlin has no idea who these people are or exactly where they operate. The nameless and the faceless in Russia are rising up against their leader, and they're doing it by taking part in operations that support Ukraine's strategy of crippling Russia from the inside. The Kremlin has its work cut out for it when it comes to putting a spin on the situation. Normally, Russia would deny and deny again, acting like nothing had happened, or the lost locomotives were scheduled to be destroyed. It can't do that this time because there is footage of the Freedom of Russia Legion's operation. Shared by the Kyiv Independent, the minute-long video demonstrates that the Legion's sabotage was a true grassroots effort. The first few seconds are shot from the perspective of some of the group's partisans who film their view of the flammable liquid that they pour inside the trains they target. After that, we see the results. Train after train aflame. Gasoline is lit, Molotov cocktails are thrown. Every single train appears to be unguarded and vulnerable, which is a massive lapse in security from a country that relies so heavily on rail to keep itself running. It almost looks like it was too easy. But far more likely is that HUR and the Freedom of Russia Legion spent weeks, perhaps even months, selecting specific trains that they knew could be accessed and were likely to be used by Russia to transport weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. The video switches between sabotages so quickly that it's difficult to get a bead on how many trains the Freedom of Russia Legion struck during the dead of night. Thankfully, we don't have to rely on footage to find out more. The Kyiv Post report offers a full breakdown of every location where the Legion struck, that shows us that this was a Russia-wide operation in keeping with the Legion's claim that it's growing to a point where the Kremlin can no longer contain it. The list goes on and on. The Legion struck in the Moscow region, taking out a train in Arkhangelskoye. Samara was the target for several strikes as trains were sabotaged in Syzran, Tolyatti, Bezanchuk, and Kinel-Cherkassky. In the Komi Republic, the rebels took out a train in Syktyvkar, and in Kemerovo, a train in Novokuznetsk was sent to the Great Rails in the sky. Sverdlovsk was among the heaviest hit regions, along with Samara, as the Freedom of Russia Legion took out trains in Bilimbai, Bogdanovich, Pavlorsk, and Nizhny Tagil. And that's not all. The partisan group is smart enough to realize that its Russian members can operate as freely in the occupied regions of Ukraine as they can in Russia itself. Members took advantage of that fact by burning up trains in the Donetsk and Kherson regions, showing Putin that his forces aren't even safe from the country's own people in the territory they have stolen from Ukraine. This was a massive operation. The Freedom of Russia Legion was also carrying on the good work done by another Ukrainian partisan movement, Artesh. As the Kyiv Post reports, Artesh has been involved in several similar railway sabotages throughout Russia. Again, the target is to disrupt the flow of equipment to the front lines of the Ukraine war. The group's most recent attack saw it destroy a railway line in the Chuvash Republic, which forced a temporary halting of a military train. It's also targeted trains and tracks in the Rostov region and Yekaterinburg. We mentioned earlier that HUR's mention of the Freedom of Russia Legion's attacks implied some coordination. Artesh's sabotage operations suggest that this coordination runs deeper than it seems. We have two separate partisan groups that are targeting Russia's rails with precise operations that are doing maximum damage to Putin's military logistics. This is no coincidence. These aren't random attacks. They are military operations being conducted by groups that have a very clear mission to knock out Russia's supply lines, and they're succeeding. That shouldn't come as a surprise once you learn a little more about what the Freedom of Russia Legion is. Back in June 2023, Reuters wrote a profile about the Legion after it had completed a spate of attacks in the Russian region of Belgorod on Ukraine's behalf. It says that the Legion was formed in the spring of 2022, and it quotes the group as stating that it was created out of the wish of Russians to fight in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine against Putin's armed gang. In other words, the Legion's members will be fighting in the Ukrainian army if they could. Given that joining Ukraine's military directly isn't an option, they're working alongside Ukraine inside Russia, providing vital intelligence and sabotage links in the process. The group claims to operate directly under Ukraine's command, which pretty much confirms HUR's involvement in the events of early November. Modern Insurgent provides more information, noting that the group consists mostly of Russian immigrants and ex-members of the Russian armed forces, so there is experience circulating throughout the group, as well as a cause. It adds that the Freedom of Russia Legion is an official unit in the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine. Right now, we don't know how big the Legion really is. When it was first formed, the group was about 100 strong, with all members being Russian army soldiers who had defected to Ukraine's side. But now, the group likely has thousands of members. It would have to in order to pull off the dozens of sabotage operations on locomotives across Russia that it and HUR have just revealed. Modern Insurgent provides some estimates. Just months after announcing its creation, the Legion claims it received as many as 300 applications in a single day. An accurate assessment of the Legion's current manpower has yet to be released. The resource estimates the group's numbers at anywhere between 500 and 2,000, who are actively participating in combat operations, and there may be many more working behind the scenes. This estimate does not include Legion members who are operating inside Ukraine, and there are clearly plenty of them, given that November saw train attacks in Kherson and Donetsk. This is a shadowy organization, a group that Putin can't see and barely understands. The only thing Russia's leader knows for sure is that the Freedom of Russia Legion has betrayed everything that Putin stands for. Its members are unknown, and that gives Putin a serious problem. How do you stop a group that is so good at hiding in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike? You don't. and that means that plenty of other infrastructure that is crucial to Russia's war effort is still at risk. Let's come back to Russia's burning locomotives. Russia will be furious that it's lost these trains for two reasons. It's already dealing with a locomotive shortage, and Russia is completely reliant on its trains for almost everything that the country transports. Starting with the shortage, the Kyiv Post says that Russia has been dealing with reduced locomotive availability and freight capacity since late 2023, all due to Western sanctions. The West's restrictions on what these companies can buy from outside of Russia mean that the components and parts that these companies need to carry out maintenance and repair are in short supply. Russian Railways has been dealing with the problem for about 2 years, the outlet says, and its repair times have skyrocketed as a result. The company operates about 20,000 trains via two companies. Locotech handles 3/4 of Russian Railways train stock, with the rest being operated by STM service. Both companies reported difficulties obtaining specialized lubricants, bearings, and electronic components due to sanctions, while staff shortages from mobilization have worsened the problem, the Kyiv Post reports. It looks like Russia's biggest rail companies were already struggling thanks to sanctions and a lack of workers. Having their trains burned beyond repair will only make a bad situation even worse. Novaya Gazeta exposed the full scale of Russia's train problems in a July piece that claims there is severe dysfunction within the Russian rail system. It says that the first 12 months of the Ukraine invasion saw train-based transport of several key categories of goods, including raw materials, collapse due to the West's sanctions. Total freight transport across Russia's freight network fell by 4% in 2022. It stabilized in 2023 but fell by another 4% in 2024 and appears to be on a similar track in 2025. By July, Russia's rail shipments had declined for 20 consecutive months, wreaking havoc on domestic and war-related operations. There are also crew problems, a lot of them. By mid-2025, Russian railways have been dealing with a shortfall of 3,000 locomotive crews and 2,500 engineers. That leaves around 200 trains in its stockpiles simply unable to run. The company still has a surplus of carriages, hundreds of thousands of them in fact, but 300,000 of those carriages are now sitting unused in the company's rail network. And more may join them now that the Freedom of Russia Legion has destroyed so many of the locomotives that pull those carriages. Those with a sense of humor could even claim that the Legion has done Russia's major rail company a service. It's gotten rid of trains that Russian railways may have been struggling to use. The point of all this is that Russia's train network is struggling. To stand any chance of recovering, it needs heavy investment in more locomotives, workers, and basic infrastructure. That need for investment only rises when groups like Freedom of Russia Legion and Artesh are destroying the very things that Russia needs more of. This all matters for the second reason why Russia is so furious with what the Freedom of Russia Legion just pulled off. Russia relies heavily on its railways, perhaps more heavily than many realize. The train network is everything in the world of Russian logistics, as Kasper Sukand pointed out in a December 2024 analysis of the Russian rail network. He called that network the Iron Leviathan, and he noted that Russia maintains about 122,000 kilometers or around 75,800 miles of railways. That network is responsible for transporting a staggering 90% of all Russia's cargo. The extent to which the Kremlin's war effort relies on the railway infrastructure cannot be overstated. The Russian armed forces are entirely dependent on the network to move troops and equipment, Sukand writes. Putin has put a lot of eggs in the Russian rail basket. The Freedom of Russia Legion has just broken a whole bunch of those eggs. Russia's Iron Leviathan, as massive as it may be, is extremely vulnerable to sabotage and aerial assaults. We mentioned earlier that it seems strange that nobody was available to stop the Freedom of Russia saboteurs from carrying out their work. The reason for this may partially come down to the employee shortages we mentioned earlier. However, Russia's sheer size and, by extension, the vastness of its rail network likely also played a part. We've already seen the problems that Russia's size causes due to Ukraine's bombing campaigns, the Atlantic Council reported in September. What was once the country's greatest asset, especially in the era when countries that tried to invade Russia via the ground had to navigate literally millions of square miles to take territory, has now become one of its greatest weaknesses. In the case of Ukraine's aerial campaigns, Russia's inability to defend the majority of its skies has come into very clear focus. Apparently, the same is true for the 75,800 square miles of rail the country has to maintain. That's a whole lot of miles to defend for a country that has lost over 1.14 million people in Ukraine, has many hundreds of thousands more fighting in the country, and is dealing with a crisis that is seeing its population decline rapidly. Gaps are starting to form in a defense that was already far from comprehensive, and Ukraine is taking advantage of those gaps by way of partisan groups like the Freedom of Russia Legion. Adding to all of this the fact that Putin is now being forced to deal with a war that's being waged inside his own country. The Freedom of Russia Legion is among the most active anti-Putin groups inside Russia, as Euromaidan Press points out. However, it's far from the only one. Putin has had to deal with rebellion before, most notably in 2023, when Wagner mercenaries rebelled against Moscow and seized the Rostov-on-Don Oblast. Those mercenaries were going to march on Moscow before the rebellion was quashed. Still, that insurrection offered one of the most prominent hints of dissent against Putin's leadership growing during the Ukraine war. Now, Russia's rebels are underground and fighting in the shadows. Newsweek notes that the Freedom of Russia Legion is joined by groups like the Russian Volunteer Corps, Siberian Battalion, and the previously mentioned Artesh. Putin already has his hands full with a Ukrainian military that is a long way from the total collapse he expected to occur years ago. With these groups battling against him from inside Russia itself, Putin's paranoia can only grow. After all, these are just the groups that are actively fighting against Russia's president. How many more of the country's people oppose Putin and his Ukraine invasion? It's a question to which Putin may never receive an accurate answer, and that will only feed into his paranoia. Despite still being embroiled in an attritional war with Ukraine that shows no signs of ending anytime soon, Russia still can't help itself. Vladimir Putin's hatred of NATO and the collective defense alliance's expansion means that he's trying to split his focus between Ukraine and the rest of NATO-aligned Europe. Now he's taking his desire to destroy NATO even further. The most recent country to enter Putin's firing line is Belgium, which has been a part of the NATO alliance since 1949. Russia is doing something sinister over the Belgian skies, and it's leaving both Belgium and the rest of NATO on edge. Since the beginning of November, Russia has allegedly been sending drones into Belgian airspace. On November 3rd, the BBC reported on the third of these incursions in as many days, noting that drones have been sighted near a Belgian military base that sits close to the country's border with the Netherlands. At the time, Belgium's defense minister, Theo Franken, was cagey when asked about who might be behind the incursions. "I have some ideas, but I'm going to be cautious," he said at the time. However, the drone operation over the course of 3 days was professional enough to leave only one likely answer: Russia. In addition to the drones sighted near the Kleine Brogel base, the BBC says more unmanned aerial vehicles have also been spotted at the Leopoldsburg and Marchand-Famenne military air bases in Belgium. Drones have also been sighted near several Belgian airports. This is clearly not a case of some over-enthusiastic hobbyist accidentally letting a drone get away from them. These drones are lurking around military bases and airports for a reason. Whoever is controlling them is trying to cause as much disruption as they can and potentially learn a few secrets along the way. And the drone incursions keep on coming. As we were creating this video, news broke that several Belgian airports have been forced to suspend flights due to the presence of drones nearby. Both the Brussels and Liège airports have been closed down for a short while on November 6th, the Brussels Times reports, though flights into and out of both have since resumed. That's another one to add to a week-long list of drone incursions that tell us that none of this is accidental. Putin's fingerprints are all over this, even if Franken wouldn't say it on November 3rd. What Franken was willing to say at the time is that the incursions at the Kleine Brogel base bore all the hallmarks of an aerial spying operation. Euronews reports that the Belgian defense minister said that the drones arrived in 2 waves. The first wave included small drones to test the radio frequencies used by Belgium's security services. As for the second, these were much larger drones deployed to destabilize the area and people. It was after revealing this information that Franken refused to identify who he thinks is responsible. But he threw yet more evidence onto the pile in terms of these incursions being part of a Russian operation, as he noted that Belgium's jammers didn't stop the drones. "The jammer didn't work because they tested our radio frequency and they changed frequency. They have their own frequencies. An amateur doesn't know how to do that," Franken said. The Belgian defense minister may not have wanted to point the finger, but he really didn't need to on November 3rd. 2 days later, the Belgian media outlet VRT reported that Belgium's security service believes what we all suspect to be true. Russia is most likely behind everything, the outlet claims, and there is already plenty of evidence to back that opinion. Building on the comments made by Franken that amateur drone operators don't know how to overcome signal jamming, VRT adds that most of the recent drone incursions occur at night. That means they're flying in the dark, which is a feat that requires no small amount of experience and technical knowledge. One hobbyist might have been able to fly their drone at night, but several per day over multiple days, it's implausible at best, and Belgium knows it. VRT adds that the drone incursions bear a striking similarity to the drone attacks launched against Denmark in October. There it appeared that the devices were launched from a ship that is part of the Russian Shadow fleet. In theory, drones can be controlled from a distance of 150 to 200 kilometers, which means that the operators are not necessarily located on Belgian territory, the outlet notes. And finally, VRT says that the increase in drone incidents in Belgium in 2025 compared to the previous year offers more evidence. In 2024, Belgium recorded 30,000 drone-related incidents, though those drones only forced aircraft to change runways on 2 occasions. Disruption was minimal. This year, the situation is getting more serious. In just a few days, 4 civil airports had to close temporarily: Brussels Airport and Liège on Tuesday evening, Ostend on Friday, and Deurne on Saturday. Again, it's all far too much to be a coincidence. Russia has to be behind this. But as is the Russian way, any suggestions that it might be behind these incursions into Belgium have been denied. That's according to the Russian news agency TASS, which said on November 6th, the Russian embassy has said that Putin and his cronies aren't doing anything. Russia has no relation to the drones in Belgian airspace. We have no reason or interest in launching any, an embassy spokesperson told VRT. The embassy followed these denials by also claiming that Russia has nothing to do with the spate of other drone incursions in countries like Poland. It's all a big fluke, Russia seems to be saying, and NATO is getting worked up over nothing. The embassy statement adds that the only proper course of action in such cases should not involve stirring up tensions or megaphone diplomacy, but rather establishing contacts and cooperation between the relevant agencies. Russia claims it's willing to do just that, and it implies that NATO is not. Regardless of what Russia says, the evidence adds up to Russian involvement. The question that Russia refuses to confront is also pretty simple. If not Russia, then who? Belgium is pretty much surrounded by NATO and European Union or EU allies, and it seems very unlikely that any of them would want to disrupt Belgium so often and consistently. There is only one country that is close enough to Belgium, has a grudge against NATO-aligned countries, and has the drone expertise to pull all this off. It's Russia, allegedly. Though Belgium still hasn't come out and said as much, Euronews reports that it and NATO are now on high alert. The outlet reports that NATO already issued a warning to Russia at the end of September after a number of aerial incursions into alliance airspace. European leaders are also raising questions about how ready NATO is as a collective to deal with Russian drone threats. Putin appears to be trying to divide NATO's members here. He's attempting to get them arguing among themselves, though the opposite seems to be happening. In its September statement, NATO said, "Russia should be in no doubt. NATO and allies will employ, in accordance with international law, all necessary military and non-military tools to defend ourselves and deter all threats from all directions," which is about as clear a message as the organization ever sends. As for Belgium, its refusal to acknowledge the likelihood that Russia is behind these recent drone incursions doesn't mean that it isn't doing anything to confront them. In a November 6th article, The Guardian noted that Belgium's National Security Council was gearing up to hold an emergency meeting. We don't know what the results of that meeting are right now, but the fact that it's happening at all proves that Belgium considers these drones a problem of national importance. Presumably, the council will discuss topics that include what to do about the drones and whether to go public with its obvious suspicions that Russia is behind all of these incursions. We'll have to wait and see. As we do, the obvious question to ask is why? If we assume that Russia is sending drones into Belgian airspace, what would motivate it to do so? The obvious answer seems to be that Putin continues to try to test NATO. However, there are other reasons why Belgium in particular would end up on the Russian president's radar. Take some strange comments that Putin made back in March 2024 as an example. In that month, Putin made the extraordinary claim that Belgium has Russia to thank for its very existence. In a speech at the World Youth Festival in Sochi, the Russian leader said, "Belgium appeared on the world map as an independent state thanks in large part to Russia and its position." He made this remark in response to a Belgian attendee of the event, the Brussels Times reports, and the outlet was quick to shoot the claim down. It notes that at the time of the Belgian Revolution, Russia was supporting the Netherlands as it attempted to suppress the Belgian rebels who wanted their own country. The truth is the very opposite of what Putin claims. The comments would have raised eyebrows in Belgium, not for their untruthfulness, but because they offered a strange parallel to the sorts of things that Putin has said both before and after launching his Ukraine invasion. Russia's leader seems to have a penchant for distorting history to justify his actions. Regarding Ukraine, Putin even published an essay in which he claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, which was essentially a coded way to claim that all Ukrainians are actually Russians. He went on to claim that Ukrainians, Russians, and Belarusians are all descended from a larger state that he calls the ancient Rus. That, it appears, is justification enough for Putin to invade. Of course, the history of Ukraine, according to Putin, is twisted, and so too are his claims about Belgium. None of this means that Russia is preparing to launch a Ukraine-like invasion against Belgium, but it almost seems like Putin has tried to claim that Russia made Belgium, with the implication being that Belgium should be grateful and that Russia could unmake the country just as it supposedly made it. Beyond these strange historical gripes, another reason for Russia's drone incursions into Belgium may be much simpler: revenge. After Russia sent drones into Polish airspace in September, the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs summoned the Russian ambassador to Belgium, Denis Gonchar, to its offices. According to TASS, that meeting saw Belgium accuse Russia of a deliberate violation of the airspace of an EU member, adding that Russia seemed to be escalating its campaign against both the EU and NATO. You can imagine how well Russia would have taken all of this, given that its official line is still that it isn't involved in any of these incursions. The fact that Belgium was so quick to respond with accusations and condemnations may have put the country on Putin's radar, assuming it wasn't already in his sights. Putin will also be paying very close attention to Belgium's potential role in the use of frozen Russian assets held by the EU. Right now, there are discussions ongoing among EU leaders about creating a loan program that would allow the bloc to borrow between $161 billion and $213 billion of the frozen assets to help Ukraine. The very idea will make Putin furious, but Belgium is one of the few EU members that's been holding out. Belgium refused to back the loan during the most recent EU summit, and it has expressed concerns that the International Monetary Fund might withdraw its support of the nation unless it acquiesces. It appears Belgium is concerned about the legality of the loan and the prospect of being pressured into going along with the rest of the EU when it isn't comfortable doing so. That's great for Putin. He knows that the Belgian firm Euroclear holds a portion of the frozen money, meaning Belgian reluctance plays into Russian hands. Why then would Russia start sending drones into Belgium? Maybe because Putin wants to deliver a threat. He might want to show Belgium that this is what it will have to deal with from now on if it ever changes position on the EU's proposed frozen asset loan. EU Observer says that Euroclear has assigned bodyguards to protect its executive board members from Russian spies. The drones flying into Belgium right now may be just another way for Putin to apply pressure on an EU nation that is vocal about how torn it is on the issue of frozen assets. We mentioned division earlier, and these drones may be Putin's way of striking enough fear into Belgian hearts that the nation will stick with its refusal to unlock the frozen assets. Finally, there's the obvious reason for the drone incursions that we've already touched on several times in the video. Russia is trying to scare NATO, perhaps even more than it's trying to scare Belgium. If the repeated incursions into Belgian airspace can't be coincidental because of their number and nature, the many other incursions into NATO countries that drones have been making over the past few months are the final nails in the coffin for Russia's claims that it isn't involved. On October 6th, the Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, published a list covering all of the airspace violations Russia's drones and aircraft are believed to have carried out since early September. Poland having to deal with military drones on September 9th triggered the most recent spate. In the month that followed, CEPA says there were a further 38 drone-related incidents recorded by NATO member states. Norway, Denmark, the Baltic states, and Belgium all reported strange drone sightings, though not all could be linked to Russia. Romania had a drone incursion to deal with in mid-September, and Estonia may have had the worst of it all. A trio of Russian MiG-31 fighter jets entered its airspace and stayed there for 12 minutes on September 19th. These are blatant intimidation tactics from Russia, and Putin is targeting NATO specifically. However, as with the most recent violations of Belgian airspace, Russia has been quick to stir the pot while also claiming that its drones have nothing to do with any of these violations. Around the same time that NATO made the statement that we mentioned earlier in the video, one of Putin's allies came back with a hellfire and brimstone response in which he lambasted Europeans for being so scared of drones that he claimed weren't coming from Russia at all. That ally was regular Putin mouthpiece Dmitry Medvedev, and Newsweek claims that he provided 5 alternate explanations for the drones that we assume Russia would also apply to the most recent incursions in Belgium. Ukraine might be trying to provoke its allies, which makes no sense at all unless Medvedev is trying to claim that Ukraine is sending drones into Europe so that its allies will falsely accuse Russia. If not Ukraine, then maybe it's pro-Russian cells operating inside the EU that have no affiliation with Russia. NATO nations might be intentionally testing their own air defenses, which again makes no sense, seeing as those nations wouldn't be complaining about the drones they themselves launch. Vague hooligans might also be to blame. And the last of the 5 is Russia, which Medvedev tried to frame as the least likely of the 5 suggestions. Really. Medvedev then raged, "The main thing is that narrow-minded Europeans should feel on their own skin what the danger of war is, that they should be afraid and tremble like dumb animals in a herd being driven to the slaughter, that they should soil themselves with fear, sensing their near and agonizing end." There it is, the real reason Russia is sending drones into NATO airspace. is trying to intimidate NATO's members, and Belgium is the latest victim. As for what all of this means for the future, some believe that Russia has already declared war against much of Europe, if not NATO itself. It just hasn't made that declaration official. On November 6th, the UK's Channel 4 News reported that the former head of NATO, Lord George Robertson, expressed regret about his time as NATO's Secretary-General. Lord Robertson served in the role between 1999 and 2003, and he said, "I basically trusted Vladimir Putin. Looking back, I often wonder whether we should have done more at the time." As for the situation now, Lord Robertson is frank, stating, "Russia is clearly at war with us. I have no doubt at all that even though we're not at war with them, they've clearly declared war on us." The us seems to refer to NATO, and Lord Robertson is making the point that Russia's drones are part of a hybrid warfare campaign. Bombs and missiles may not be flying, but Russia is already in a fight that NATO isn't yet fully participating in. The latest incursions into Belgian airspace are simply the latest Russian act of war in an ongoing campaign when taken into Lord Robertson's context. There are others who echo this viewpoint. Reuters reports that the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has called the drone incursions a form of hybrid warfare that's intended to sow division among Europe's EU and NATO members. At the very least, the incursions are testing NATO air defenses, with Russia being very interested in figuring out the scale of the response it will receive for its actions. Other NATO nations that have already been affected by Russia's drones are taking action. ABC News reports that both Poland and Romania are deploying new weapon systems that are designed to tackle Russian drones. Both are using the American-made Merops drone defense system. Transportable via pickup truck, the system can identify drones and zone in on them. It even uses artificial intelligence to overcome the jamming that those drones might try to use to prevent the system from taking the drone out. Denmark, which has also been targeted by Russia's drones, is also going to deploy Merops, ABC News says. As for Belgium, it isn't at that point. Yet. As we await the results of the meeting of its National Security Council, we can only guess at what the country will do in response to Russia's sinister actions in its airspace. Will Belgium buckle under Russia's pressure, or will it join Poland, Romania, and Denmark by deploying systems designed to counter Russia's scare tactics? We'll find out soon. The Shahed drone has become one of Russia's most important weapons. Ever since Russia managed to secure its first few batches from Iran and later learned how to build Shaheds itself, it's been using them to hit Ukraine's cities and infrastructure hard. Shaheds are cheap, easy to launch, and with Russia now occupying about 19% of Ukraine, they can be launched from inside Ukraine itself. These Shaheds had to be dealt with. Ukraine just delivered a death blow to them. A Russian frontline base used to store scores of Shahed drones was engulfed in a massive fireball as Ukraine strikes hard against the Shaheds on its own territory. That's according to the Kyiv Post, which reported on November 6th that Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have pulled off a strike that hit a major base used to store Russian drones located in Donetsk. That region is where the fighting in Ukraine is most intense, with Russia controlling about 75% of the oblast in a slow and grinding push that has lasted for as long as the Ukraine war has raged. Putin desperately wants Donetsk, and now that Russia occupies such a substantial amount of the oblast, it's using the territory it's captured to launch devastating drone strikes against the rest of Ukraine. Taking out the drones stored in Donetsk was a priority. Ukraine just did it. The commander of the country's unmanned systems forces, Robert Madiar Brovdi, was among the first to confirm the success of Ukraine's latest strike. He took to Telegram to provide some details, stating, "Developing this complex target took painstaking work over several months, assembled from small pieces. Last night it was executed with the appropriate strike assets of the SSO and missile troops." The Kyiv Post adds that Brovdi also claimed that the base Ukraine struck was used for storing, equipping, and launching Shahed drones. Thanks to Ukraine, the base no longer exists, he adds. And there's footage that Brovdi claims proves it. A 17-second clip shared with his Telegram post shows a massive explosion taking place, followed by a thunderous crash that suggests Ukraine used something other than its drones for this assault. As fire and smoke rise from the sky, it's clear that Ukraine hit something big, something explosive. Brovdi says that it was a Shahed drone facility, though the Kyiv Post points out that it hasn't been able to independently verify the footage. Perhaps it won't need to. The size of the explosion alone might be proof enough. Another Telegram channel named Spy Dossier followed up with more details of how Ukraine pulled off this damaging strike. It claims that Ukraine used both drones and cruise missiles in the attack, though it doesn't specify which types. Based on the size of the explosion in Brovdi's video, it seems safe to assume that Ukraine's new FP2 drone may have been involved. That drone has been designed specifically to enable Ukraine to strike Russian positions in the deep rear behind the front lines, and it packs a 230-pound warhead that hits very hard. Ukraine has pulled off several attacks with this new drone in the last week alone, as you'll learn if you check out our video covering how Ukraine used the FP2 to brutally destroy one of Russia's elite drone units on its own territory. Militarny offers a few more details, though it also doesn't reveal which drones and missiles Ukraine used. It says that Ukraine's drones, whichever ones they may be, managed to achieve a 90% strike success rate, which is damning evidence that Russia's air defenses are either non-existent at some of its most crucial facilities or are incapable of dealing with the new weapons Ukraine is using to hit Russia in the deep rear. Ukraine clearly identified a vulnerability in Russia's Shahid storage base, and it took full advantage on the night leading into November 6th. And when we say full advantage, we really mean it. Russia lost far too many drones due to Ukraine's attack. In its report on the Ukrainian strike, United 24 Media says that the destroyed drone storage facility was a home to a staggering 1,000 Shahids, or as the Russians call their version, Geran-2 drones. Additionally, the facility stored around 1,500 warheads, which would presumably be strapped to the drones that Russia launches against Ukraine from Donetsk. This is big because the sheer number of drones and warheads at the base suggests that Russia was gearing up for a massive aerial assault against Ukrainian cities that are within range of its Shahids from Donetsk. Now those strikes aren't going to happen, and it may take weeks for Russia to transport more Shahids into Donetsk to use for its planned strikes. So Ukraine bought itself a little breathing room during its overnight drone assault. However, the burning of the Shahid base is mirrored by the hole that Ukraine has just burned in the Russian pocketbook. In its report on Ukraine's strike, the Express estimates that the combined cost of the destroyed Shahids and warheads amounts to about £60 million, which is roughly $78.8 million. Let's put those figures into context. In an article where it calculated the effectiveness of Russia's Shahid drone assaults on Ukraine, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, estimated that a Russian-made Shahid drone costs about $35,000 to build. Russia has been taking advantage of this low cost as it launched 14,700 of these drones at Ukraine between September 28, 2022 and December 28, 2024, CSIS added. Even with a less than 10% hit ratio, CSIS adds, the Shahids are proving very cost-effective for Russia. However, they can only be cost-effective if they make it into the skies, and that's what Ukraine just prevented from happening. Destroying 1,000 of Russia's Shahids at a unit cost of $35,000 amounts to a total of $3.5 million. If the Express figures are correct, that would mean that Russia somehow has about $75 million worth of warheads stored in the base. Something doesn't add up here, especially if those warheads were intended to be strapped to the Shahids. It's possible that these warheads were instead intended for Russian missiles, which would up their cost considerably. Perhaps, though, this is speculation. There's no information about the type of warheads Ukraine may have destroyed. For what it's worth, the Express doesn't provide any evidence to back this number. However, other sources also suggest that Shahids may cost more to build than CSIS claims. Defense Express, for instance, said in August that Russia is spending about $70,000 on each of its Shahids. That would double the total for the 1,000 Shahids stored at the base Ukraine struck, though it would still mean that the Express values the 1,500 warheads at over $70 million. Still, even if we disregard the Express's estimate, between $3.5 million and $7 million lost in a single strike will sting Russia. It's also worth noting that this number doesn't account for any costs related to transporting the Shahids to the Donetsk facility that Ukraine just took out, nor does it account for whatever Russia is spending on storing and defending that facility. It's possible that adding these tangible costs could mean that the loss of 1,000 Shahids alone has cost Russia closer to $10 million. The cost of the warheads is added on top, like a cherry on a burning sundae that Ukraine just shoved down Putin's throat. There is a caveat to all of this. The 1,000 Shahids and 1,500 warheads are just what Russia is known to have stored at its Donetsk base. That doesn't necessarily mean that Ukraine managed to destroy all of them in its November strike. But even if all weren't taken out, it seems likely that Ukraine made a serious dent in Russia's Shahid stockpiles. How do we know? In a Facebook post, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine said that there were more explosions at Russia's Donetsk facility than just those caused by Ukraine's drones and cruise missiles. According to objective control data, explosions and powerful secondary detonation were recorded on the site, the General Staff reported. This makes sense. A facility used to store warheads is naturally going to be prone to multiple explosions due to the very nature of the equipment stored there. It appears that Ukraine's drones and missiles caused a chain reaction of explosions that may well have been enough to take out Russia's entire stockpile of Shahids and warheads. Perhaps a more detailed assessment of the strike's success is forthcoming. For now, another Ukrainian military unit has also confirmed the Donetsk attack was successful. The Kyiv Post reports that Ukraine's Special Operations Forces, or SSO, have also commented on the strike. On the evening of November 5th, Special Operations Forces units carried out a strike on a base used for storing, equipping, and launching Shahed drones in temporarily occupied Donetsk. The enemy's military infrastructure was located on the grounds of the former international airport, the SSO reported. That's the second mention of the Donetsk airport, and it showcases one of Russia's strategies. As the Kyiv Independent reported back in August, Russia is turning vast swathes of occupied Ukraine into giant military bases that it's using to cause further pain to Ukraine. Commercial airports are obvious targets. They already contain hangars, runways, and buildings that could be used as storage facilities, even if those buildings aren't hardened to a military standard. The outlet highlights the Donetsk International Airport as one of its key examples. The airport had actually been derelict for over a decade, according to the Kyiv Independent. That means Russia would have had to put in more work than usual to make the airfield usable as a base. And thanks to satellite images received from Planet Labs, the Kyiv Independent managed to confirm that there had been a build-up on top of the foundations of the old airport months before the Ukraine strike. Whatever Russia built didn't seem to help. And according to the founder of the Ukrainian open-source intelligence project Kiba Boroshno, Vadim Hlushko, that's not exactly surprising. This is the so-called ramshackle infrastructure, garages for storing and launching kamikaze drones of the Shahed type. In addition to the main launch installations, they also set up so-called decoys, fake launch positions and false locations, Hlushko said. The use of the word ramshackle probably tells us everything that we need to know. The base that Ukraine just hit wasn't a full military base. It may well have just been a collection of hastily erected sheds and warehouses that just went up in flames. Ukraine won't care about the type of buildings Russia had built on its disused Donetsk airport. It will care about the up to 1,000 Shaheds and 1,500 warheads that Russia could no longer launch into Ukraine from occupied Donetsk. November 5th was a terrible night for Russia inside occupied Ukraine. But if you thought Ukraine was going to stop with taking out a key Shahed storage facility, you're sorely mistaken. Ukraine hasn't forgotten about the oil refineries against which it spent the last few months launching repeated drone strikes. And on November 6th, it complemented its destruction of Russia's Donetsk Shaheds with yet another refinery strike that will feed into the oil crisis that is raging in Russia. That's according to the Kyiv Independent, which reports that explosions rocked the site of Russia's Volgograd oil refinery, causing several fires in the process. The refinery is one of Russia's largest, as it has a 15.7 million ton refining capacity that makes it responsible for 5.6% of all the refining done inside Russia. Ukraine hasn't just deprived Russia of one of its most vital weapons during the last couple of days, it's also scored yet another blow against Russia's ability to make the gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel the Russian military needs to continue waging Putin's war. The facility Ukraine hit is about 300 miles away from the front lines, the Kyiv Independent reports. And, unlike with the Donetsk strike, Russia has actually commented on this one. The Volgograd regional governor, Andrei Bocharov, has claimed that a 48-year-old civilian has died as a result of Ukraine's refinery strike. This isn't confirmed independently, and as usual, Russia is trying to avoid all mention of the refinery that just went up in flames. Ukraine's refinery strikes are having a major impact on Russia's ability to fight. By early October, some outlets were reporting that Ukraine had knocked out 38% of Russia's refining capacity, the Carnegie Endowment says. August and September saw Ukraine attack 16 of Russia's refineries. Combined, those 16 refineries have an annual maximum capacity of 123 million tons of oil. That's 38% of Russia's total maximum of 327 million tons. But there is a caveat. The 38% figure assumes that all of the plants operate at full capacity and that Ukraine's strikes were enough to shut them down completely. Neither may have been the case, the Carnegie Endowment says, so 38% may be an overestimate. It doesn't really matter. Ukraine's constant refinery strikes have still been enough to put a major dent in Russia's fuel production. That dent is so large that many Russian regions are now dealing with gasoline shortages that are causing price increases and limitations at the pump. The Jamestown Foundation says that Russia's gasoline production fell by almost 25% in September alone, and Ukraine's drone strikes are the reason why. Ukraine has been hitting each individual refinery multiple times, making it hard for Russia to complete repairs as it creaks under the weight of the West's sanctions. So Ukraine delivered a double blow to Russia from November 5th through to November 6th. With its strike on occupied Donetsk, Ukraine took out a huge number of the drones that Russia has been using to hit Ukrainian cities. It followed that up with yet another refinery strike that heaps further misery onto Russia's people, while also causing additional damage to the Russian military. That sounds like a productive couple of days to us. But November 5th in particular was a vital day for Ukraine because Russia had spent so much of 2025 ramping up its Shahed strikes. On November 4th, Sky News offered a roundup of the sheer scale of Russia's drone assaults on Ukraine in 2025. The headline figure, is that the number of Shahids and other drones that Russia has launched at Ukraine during the first 10 months of 2025 is 303% higher than the number it launched during the entirety of 2024. That 303% increase amounts to a total of 44,000 Shahid and Shahid variants launched at Ukraine as of the end of October. More of those drones are hitting their marks too. Ukraine has destroyed 64% of the 2025 drones compared to 68% in 2024. Shahids have killed at least 494 civilians between January and September, Sky News adds. That shows us that Russia isn't just using its drones to strike military targets, it's purposefully terrorizing Ukraine's citizens and seems more than happy to kill people who aren't fighting in the war. The Kyiv Independent and RBC Ukraine both add that Russia's Shahids have been getting more dangerous over time. In May, the former reported that Russia's Shahids are now capable of traveling at speeds of between 380 and 400 kilometers, or about 236 to 248 miles per hour. They're also being equipped with 90-kilogram warheads, meaning they can pack as much as 198 pounds of explosive force. In other words, Russia has been working on upgrades. The increased scale of the country's drone assaults on Ukraine is being compounded by the fact that many of the 2025 drones hit harder than those that Russia was launching in 2024. Toward the end of October, RBC Ukraine highlighted how dangerous these newer Shahid drones are by sharing comments made by Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky. Shahids have in some cases become more dangerous than ballistic missiles. We can shoot down a ballistic missile, at least in places where we have a Patriot system. But to bring down such a large number of Shahids flying at such altitudes, we have to use everything, Zelensky claimed. He really means everything too. Interceptor drones, helicopters, F-16s and ground-based air defenses are all part of the Ukrainian toolkit for dealing with Russia's Shahids. And if things have been bad for much of 2025, the last few months are going to get worse. On November 2nd, Newsweek reported that Russia had launched more than 1,500 drones at Ukraine in the space of a week. The reason why is already clear to anybody who has been paying attention to Russia's winter tactics during the war. Putin wants to knock out as much of Ukraine's energy infrastructure as possible. Again, it's all about causing as much pain to Ukrainian civilians as possible, as Russia hopes that it can leave many of them dealing with blackouts and a lack of heating as Ukraine's freezing cold winter descends. The odds are that the 1,000 Shahids and 1,500 warheads in Donetsk were going to be part of this winter campaign. After all, occupied Donetsk is the perfect place from which to launch drones that could strike almost any target in Ukraine. The success of Ukraine's attack on Russia's drone storage facility may mean that several of its cities can avoid dealing with the energy crisis that Putin is trying to create. Even a few extra days of electricity and heating could make a lot of difference for the people who no longer have to worry about the Shahids Ukraine just burned to the ground. Ukraine is more aware than anybody else of how dangerous Russia's Shahids are. That's why the November 5th strike in Donetsk is just the latest in a multi-month campaign designed to prevent as many of these dangerous drones from launching as possible. As the Kyiv Post points out, Ukraine has been hitting Russia's drone facilities hard since at least July. On July 1st, Ukraine destroyed 4 workshops in the Kupol electromechanical plant in Izyevsk. That plant builds drones along with air defense systems, so it's pretty clear what Ukraine's goal was. In the Moscow region, Ukraine hit a plant that builds Shahid drones on July 4th. A month or so later, it also hit a storage facility in Tatarstan that provides components Russia uses to build Shahids. And on August 15th, Ukraine carried out a strike on the Olya seaport that sank an Iranian ship carrying more drone parts that Russia intended to use. The strike on the storage facility in Donetsk wasn't a one-off, it was part of a campaign. Ukraine will be under no illusions about the impact of its attack. As impressive as the strike was, it knows that Russia has thousands more Shahids in facilities throughout Russia and occupied Ukraine. Perhaps as important as the destruction of the drones is the message that Ukraine delivered to Russia on November 5th. It can now hit Russian drone facilities that lie beyond the front lines. That means any storage buildings that Russia is using are now under threat. With a little luck, Ukraine will be able to hit enough of these types of targets to minimize the impact of Russia's incoming winter hordes. It will have to. After all, Putin has shown many times over that he doesn't care how many of Ukraine's civilians die due to Russia's Shahid drones.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is no longer the strong and stable figure of authority he once was. Increasingly isolated, paranoid, and entirely detached from reality, the 73-year-old leader can feel the tide turning against him. His war in Ukraine has been an abject failure, his country's economy is crumbling, and his former allies have turned their backs on him. The Russian people too, including those who once looked up to him, voted for him and supported him, are growing increasingly angry and upset with their leader's reckless, nonsensical decisions, with protests and pockets of rebellion rising up across the nation. Feeling his power slip slowly away, Putin is desperate to shift the blame for his country's chaotic condition wherever he can, purging numerous generals, elites and officials in recent months. Now, he's even beginning to turn on his closest and most loyal allies, conveying the message that no one is safe and sending the Kremlin spiraling into chaos in the process. Putin has always been known as a ruthless leader, a man who would do almost anything for power, no matter the cost. But he's also built a reputation as someone who values loyalty above all else, rewarding and honoring those that stay true to him, and only taking out his wrathful fury on those that he feels have betrayed, insulted, or disobeyed him. Back when he was first elected president in 2000, he reportedly organized a meeting with 21 of the richest men in Russia, the oligarchs as they were nicknamed by the public. In the 1990s, while the country around them descended into chaos, these men seized any opportunities they could find, indulging in corruption, shady business deals, and even worse crimes to amass their fortunes and ascend to the upper echelons of society. In effect, they controlled much of the country's economy and also held great sway over its political system and wider society too. But once Putin stepped foot in the Kremlin, he assembled them all in order to officially let them know who was really in charge. According to reports, Putin allegedly offered the oligarchs a deal that would in many ways define the rest of his political progression and the future of the Russian Federation from that point on. He would allow the oligarchs to keep their fancy mansions, private jets, and enormous enterprises so long as they stayed out of his way and accepted his authority. Perhaps sensing that they were in the presence of a man who was not playing around, many of the oligarchs agreed to the deal, and they were rewarded for their loyalty. Their fortunes multiplied, their positions of power were solidified, and they were allowed to live out lives of luxury and opulence. Those that reneged on the agreement, however, felt the full force of the president's wrath. Mikhail Khodorkovsky, for example, once deemed the richest man in Russia, was arrested by Russian authorities in 2003 and sentenced to 9 years in a Siberian prison for fraud and tax evasion charges. Many outside observers, however, felt that the arrest of Khodorkovsky was politically motivated, since he had been providing funding for opposition parties. Vladimir Guzinski was another to suffer at Putin's hands. Once a cab driver, he soon proved himself a shrewd businessman as new opportunities emerged after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, eventually starting his own newspaper and the first private TV station in Russia, NTV. NTV ran a famous satirical puppet show with scenes that were critical of the Kremlin, and while Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin, tolerated the show, Putin could not abide by it. In 2000, armed agents raided the NTV offices and Guzinski was arrested on charges of stealing $10 million. He eventually fled overseas to Spain. Other oligarchs who defied Putin were forced into exile. Some have even died in suspicious circumstances. Each time something happened to one of them, it helped to cement Putin's status as a leader who evidently valued loyalty, but abhorred disobedience and dissent, and would not shy away from punishing those that got on his bad side. In his autobiography, the Russian leader has even proclaimed, "I have a lot of friends, but only a few people are really close to me. They've never gone away, they've never betrayed me, and I haven't betrayed them either. In my view, that's what counts most." And so it has been for a long time. Putin may have purged numerous officials and elites who upset him in one way or another, but he's always stood by the select few who have proven their loyalty and commitment to the Kremlin's cause. Now, that's all starting to change, as there have been no fewer than 4 high-profile examples in recent times of loyalist Russian figures being shunned or punished by the Kremlin. Sergei Markov was one of them. A political scientist and journalist, Markov has held numerous high-profile positions at some of Russia's most prestigious educational institutions, like Moscow State University. He was also, for a time, one of Putin's closest advisors and staunchest supporters, repeatedly labeling the Russian president as one of history's great men. For years, Markov said and did all the right things to endear himself to the Russian leader and enjoyed plenty of power in return for his loyalty. He was a member of the Public Chamber of Russia for several years and was elected to the State Duma in 2007. He also served as one of Putin's most trusted spokesmen during the 2012 elections, and has often appeared in Western media as a pro-Kremlin pundit parroting Putin's propaganda. When the war with Ukraine began, Markov once more towed the line, saying exactly what he was supposed to say, following along with Putin's own narrative and using his platform to influence opinions among the public and garner support for the invasion. He claimed, for example, that the war was not against Ukraine but to liberate Ukraine. Like Putin, Markov also spoke of neo-Nazi elements and terrorists taking over Ukraine, arguing that Russia's so-called special military operation was a sort of humanitarian intervention. He also called out America's role in the conflict, claiming to Sky News back in 2022 that the war was not between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the United States puppet who now occupy Ukraine. It's liberation of Ukraine, and it's a proxy war of United States against Russia. We believe there's no independent Ukrainian government, and this government is wholly under the control of the United States security community. Markov has been a loyal servant to Putin for years. However, on August 22 of this year, he was officially classified as a foreign agent by the Russian Justice Ministry. This label is typically reserved for those people that Moscow feels are colluding with other countries or engaging in political machinations against the Kremlin. Countless journalists, activists, celebrities, and even ordinary Russian citizens who simply disagree with the current regime or show support for other countries have been deemed foreign agents and effectively treated like criminals. But this is one of the few occasions in which such a high-profile political analyst who has spent his entire career being pro-Putin and pro-Kremlin has been slapped with the same label. It allegedly occurred because Markov is believed to maintain close connections with the political elites of Azerbaijan. In recent times, relations between Moscow and Baku have reached an all-time low, but Markov reportedly continued to visit and engage with Azerbaijani officials, even bowing and groveling at the feet of the country's president, Ilham Aliyev, according to Alexander Kots, a self-proclaimed war correspondent. Naturally, this didn't please Putin. He demands absolute loyalty and doesn't take kindly to those who show any sort of allegiance or kinship with other countries' leaders, especially those that have angered or defied him. Thus, Markov was punished and will almost certainly struggle to ever recover his former status. Having committed so much to the Kremlin, the analyst was, understandably, astonished to be labelled a foreign agent, initially claiming that it must be some sort of mistake or defamation, before going on to suggest that enemies of Russia were responsible, completely refusing to believe that his close ally, Vladimir Putin, would ever do anything like this against him. "I'm not a foreign agent, and everyone knows it perfectly well. For 25 years, I've supported and continue to support Vladimir Putin's policies. I'm also under Canadian sanctions. This attack against me is being carried out by enemies of Russia and by enemies of Vladimir Putin's policies. Sooner or later, these people will reveal themselves as traitors or will be removed from office as corrupt officials." Several months have passed since then, but Putin hasn't come to his rescue. Markov is still labelled a foreign agent, and while he continues to commentate on the war with Ukraine and other matters of international politics, he no longer enjoys the influence and importance he once had. Roman Alyoshin is another pro-Putin Russian nationalist who would never have been exposed to fall onto the foreign agent list. Hailing from the Kursk region of Russia, which borders Ukraine, Alyoshin once worked as a policeman before moving into business and then finding his calling in the media. He bought up several Kursk outlets and developed a strong online following with more than 150,000 followers on Telegram. After the invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, he began to post regularly about the conflict, while also raising funds for those on the front lines. In November 2022, he was appointed head of the regional volunteer organization named We Are Together, and by summer 2024, he'd clearly caught the Kremlin's eye and was honored with an advisory role for Kursk's regional governor, Alexei Smirnov. Then, things started to go wrong. First, Smirnov was arrested for allegedly embezzling 1 billion rubles that was supposed to be used to construct defensive fortifications along the border with Ukraine. Alyoshin soon resigned from his role. Not long after, he was accused of using donations that were supposed to support the war effort to buy himself a luxury car. Then in March 2025, Alyorkin announced he had signed up to fight with the Akhmat Special Forces Battalion, taking part in an operation to recapture parts of the Kursk region from Ukrainian armed forces after they had crossed over the border and taken control of several Russian towns and settlements in 2024. He made lofty claims about his heroics on the battlefield, but soon announced that he was terminating his military contract. After that, Alyorkin came under increasing scrutiny, with a video going viral on Russian social media in which he's seen openly discussing money laundering scams. Russia's Interior Ministry subsequently launched an official investigation into the matter, and in September of this year, Alyorkin was officially classified as a foreign agent, just like Markov. And like Markov, he reacted with shock and incredulity to the news, taking to Telegram to share his view. In a lengthy post, Alyorkin argued that he's never received funding from any foreign nations and that the very prospect of him being labeled a foreign agent was absurd. He added that he'd been sanctioned by the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, had only ever strived to provide support to Russian troops on the front lines, and would never betray his motherland or the Russian people. But none of that was enough to get his name taken off the foreign agent list. Now, both men are legally obliged to state that they are foreign agents every single time they post online. They also face crippling financial restrictions and are likely to be shunned by other groups and personalities who don't wish to be tarred with the same brush. Even if Alyorkin was indeed guilty of corruption, that wouldn't have necessarily mattered all that much in the past. Putin and the rest of his Kremlin cohorts have famously turned a blind eye to acts of corruption and other crimes, so long as the perpetrators demonstrate sufficient levels of loyalty. There was a time when someone like Alyorkin would have been rewarded for his actions, honored with increasingly important positions of power, and allowed to live a luxurious and comfortable life while playing the role the Kremlin wanted him to play. Instead, he, like numerous others, has been cut off and cast aside. An even worse punishment befell Tatiana Montian, a Ukrainian-born lawyer, journalist, and pro-Russian blogger. Born in Kerch, on the Crimean Peninsula, Montian studied law at Moscow State University before moving to Kyiv, where she played an increasingly active role in high-profile political cases as the years went by. She opposed the Euromaidan protests in 2013, for example, and defended controversial figures such as pro-Russian blogger Ruslan Kotsaba and neo-Nazi militant Vita Zavaruka. Before the war began, Montian reportedly left Ukraine for Russia, going on to become a familiar face on Russian TV networks and in online videos, sharing her support for the invasion of her homeland and the killing of her compatriots. But it didn't matter how much pro-Putin propaganda she spouted or how many appearances she made on the Kremlin-owned RT network, because on October 27, Montian was deemed not merely a foreign agent, but a terrorist and extremist in the eyes of the Russian government. This is one of the most severe labels the Kremlin can apply, often reserved for those it views as its most dangerous enemies. The Kremlin hasn't explained exactly what Montian did to deserve such an extreme classification, though she has faced scrutiny over misappropriation of money she raised for frontline forces. Montian also spoke about what she called war crimes and total disorder at the front, which may have been sufficient to irritate Kremlin officials just enough to take action against her. Either way, just like Alyorkin, this sort of incident simply wouldn't have occurred a few years ago. When the war began, for example, Putin and Kremlin officials were no doubt thrilled to see someone like Montian on their side, a Ukrainian-born pro-war propagandist they could use to prove that their invasion was just and necessary. Normally, she should have been able to expect a life of comfort and security in Moscow, rising up the ranks of power, perhaps even being awarded with her own TV show or hosting position on a prominent news network, all while enjoying the backing and support of the president himself. Instead, she's now the subject of a major criminal case. Her bank accounts have been frozen, and she's under full state surveillance, with a very unclear future lying ahead of her. The fourth Putin loyalist to have recently seen his status take a sudden and drastic downturn is the most famous and influential of them all, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. Lavrov has been a major player in the war so far, and is a man who has dedicated his whole life to serving his homeland. He entered politics in the 1980s, becoming deputy director and then director of the Foreign Ministry's Department of International Organizations, before moving into increasingly higher positions of power, eventually becoming Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations and then in 2004 its foreign affairs minister. Lavrov still holds his position. He hasn't been placed on any foreign agent lists, labeled a terrorist or anything quite that dramatic just yet, but rumors and reports suggest that his influence inside the Kremlin is drastically deteriorating. He was notably absent from a November 5 meeting of Russia's Security Council, for example. In addition, Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, announced that Lavrov had been replaced as the head of Russia's delegation for an upcoming G20 summit. Peskov specifically stated that Putin himself had made this decision, clearly suggesting some sort of rift between the president and one of the longest-serving members of his government. Reporters believe that Lavrov's declining status is linked to recent failed talks between the foreign minister and US Secretary of State Marco Rubio. On October 20, the two men spoke over the phone, with Rubio attempting to lay the groundwork for a meeting between Putin and US President Donald Trump. While the call allegedly went well, the US soon cancelled a planned face-to-face meeting of Lavrov and Rubio, then called off the Putin-Trump meeting altogether. It seems that Kremlin officials blame Lavrov for this dramatic breakdown in Russia-US relations. And the man whose position once seemed utterly unshakable now faces the very real risk of political isolation or even dismissal from the post he's held since 2004. On their own, these isolated cases may not mean all that much. But together, and combined with other smaller incidents of pro-Putin bloggers, generals, elites and officials all being purged from their positions or even arrested in recent weeks and months, it's clear that something has changed inside the Kremlin. Putin is no longer respecting and honoring those who have shown him loyalty over the years. He's punishing even his closest allies the very second they step out of line. Russian political scientist Ekaterina Shulman believes that this is simply the next logical step in the Kremlin's repressive evolution, stating, "First, they went after the anti-war voices, now there are none left, and the repressive machine cannot be stopped." She also expects more arrests, punishments, and foreign agents to emerge in the coming weeks and months, adding, "The Russian repressive apparatus has to fill its quotas. The machine must keep feeding itself." In other words, Putin has started something that even he cannot stop. No longer content with merely locking up and eliminating his political enemies, he's now going after those that are, for all intents and purposes, his allies. The longer this continues, the more chaotic it will become, as even government ministers, loyalist oligarchs and long-term propagandists begin to look over their shoulders, wondering if their name is next on the president's seemingly never-ending hit list. And it may prove fatal for Putin in the long term, as the list of those that remain loyal to him shrinks ever smaller, leaving him utterly absent of allies at a time he needs them the most. Now, learn more about how some of Putin's closest allies have begun to turn away from him in this video, which looks at how the Kremlin's puppet regimes are slowly severing ties with Moscow. Or check out this video to see how one Russian official recently predicted a possible outbreak of civil war on Russian soil in the not too distant future. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so you can stay informed and up to date on all the latest military news from Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere across the globe.